Married and in ministry, how well are you serving together as partners? We're talking about that today on the Church Revitalization Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast, brought to you by the Malphurs Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and AJ Matthew.
Welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast. My name is Scott Ball, and I'm joined not by my friend and co-host, AJ Matthew. AJ is gone this week. Today, I'm joined by my friend, Matt Messner, and his wife, Heidi. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. Matt is a certified guide with the Malphurs Group, and Heidi is a regional pastor with the Foursquare Church, overseeing over 50 churches in Northern California, Utah, and Nevada. And I know it's Nevada and not Nevada. I've been corrected. And I'm excited to have them on the podcast today because they are married and they are in ministry. And they happen to come from a more egalitarian background theologically, but a lot of you who are listening to the podcast come from a more complementarian background. We're not going to solve that debate today. But it doesn't really matter, because at the end of the day, if you're married and you're in ministry, your partner's in ministry. And so the topic today is, how can we do ministry better together? All right. All that being said, Heidi and Matt, welcome to the podcast. I'm glad to have you guys on.
Yeah, it's good to be here. And I love this subject too. I'm really glad to be able to share on this, because we've been doing this together, as long as we've been together, which is like 32 years, 33 years. And we've served in a number of different contexts where it was more complementarian or egalitarian. So we've kind of had to adapt, but we've always affirmed a calling that is not just together, but individual, and been trying to figure out how do you fulfill that? How do you really support each other through that?
Yeah, thank you for having us. This is really wonderful to be with you, and the subject is close to our hearts because we get this question often: how do you work together, from leaders, whether married or not? And it's an important question to ask. How do you partner together in ministry? And it's one of the things that Jesus wanted us to learn, and he said constantly with the Father how he was honoring the Father and looking to the Father for everything. He said, it'll be better when I leave so you can have the Holy Spirit. And so he was very honoring and you see that in the Trinity often, is just how much they honored one another and worked together, and how important the Trinity was in its function as a unit. And so partnership is an important part of learning how to be more like Jesus, more like God.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, what I want to do is maybe just ask a few questions so that we can all kind of glean from your experience in leading and serving together. The first question that I have is, Matt, you mentioned calling, this idea of calling. And the reality is that you have, you may feel a personal calling on your life into ministry, and you certainly have individual gifts that you've been given. Just Ephesians 4 tells us to each of us has been given a special grace gift, or a special ability that's above and beyond our normal personality and skills and things. And the purpose of this special grace gift is to fulfill the work of the ministry. And so each of us does have an individual calling. At the same time, you also have a calling as a couple, both sort of in the marriage context and also serving together. So I guess my first question is, how do you parse those things out? How do you, especially if you've got similar skill sets, like maybe you both like teaching, or you both like organizational things, or you both, whatever. How do you manage that tension of, okay, this is your space, this is my space? Again, let's sort of separate ourselves from whatever the cultural requirements are, for at least for this first question, just in sort of discerning roles and calling. How do you decipher that individually, but then as a couple, if that makes sense?
Well, I think most ministry couples, they may have met, or many of them met in a Bible college or a seminary, and it wasn't like one of them went there to find a spouse necessarily, right? They went there because they felt
that's the joke, though, right?
Right.
Especially
And
for the
so
women,
like
they get their MRS degree. They don't finish.
exactly, yeah. Uh, so when Heidi went to Bible college, she felt called to ministry, and that calling didn't go away when we married. And
Yeah.
so I've always felt like, we all have our individual view of what God has called us to do. Heidi has her individual view, I have mine. And I've come to believe that the tension that there is there, because they're not exactly the same. But if we communicate a great deal about our heart and our passion, and as we submit to one another, and as we honor one another, and as we help each other fulfill that, then there's a kind of a tension that brings us in on a different path. It's not just my path. It's not just her path. There's some compromise involved in that, and that's where we really find the will of God for us together.
Mm.
So even if that involves some compromise, I think ultimately that's going to put us each on a path that is better and is more fulfilling and is more impactful. And so, but that takes recognizing it's not just about my gifts, it's really about hers, and she feels the same way about me. So as we honor one another, we can head down that pathway. So, but that does create some tension, because there may be some specifics. Like she might feel like, hey, I want to go to Albania. Like that's always been a dream. Are we going to go to Albania or not? I don't know, maybe not, but we are going to have a heart for
That's
Albania.
very
We're
obscure.
going to pray.
Like, that's very specific. I'm not
I
even
grew up
sure
on
that
the
I
mission
know where that
field.
is.
I grew up on the mission field. We smuggled Bibles into Eastern Europe, and Albania was where
Yeah.
we could not get in. Even though all the countries were closed, it was a different, Westerners couldn't go in at all. And so it was one of the countries I never went to. And so that's why it's been, since I was young, a very, deep desire.
Under communism, they declared themselves as the only completely atheistic state in the in the world. That's what they.
Oh, wow.
So they that was their bragging point. So so it was always a challenge for Heidi to let's go to Albania.
Yeah.
Have a map, and you're looking at the countries. My parents had chose the countries we're going into. We didn't know it was so covert, at the time.
Right.
We were the cover, the three children, dragging them around the world.
Really, they're innocent. Yeah. No wonder they have such big suitcases.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, but they were all hidden, in walls and
Oh, wow. That's cool. That's a whole other podcast. We need to do
other.
Yeah. Now I'm curious. I was actually with a ministry couple recently, was working with a church, and we were having this discussion about expectations, both managing. I'm see if I can ask this well, because Heidi, I'm curious on your perspective on this. I'm trying not to say who this person was. I'm trying to explain the situation, so it's anonymized. But I basically was asking the pastor's wife who was at this meeting. I said, "What is it that you want to do here? What role do you want to play on the team? And what are the expectations of the people who are here? And is there any kind of what you would be doing? And do those things align? Like, does your feeling of what you're equipped to do and gifted to do, and the expectations of the congregation, are those in alignment?" Can you maybe share about a time where there was a mismatch and how you handled that, and or maybe it's just been all aces and there's never been a mismatch?
Right.
So there have been a number of times where things were very challenging for me. I grew up in a very egalitarian home, living around the world, watching people be free in the world once they came to know Jesus. And as an example, we lived in India for many years, planting some home churches and things. And during that time, when the men would come to the Lord, they were the ones who were so excited because they could now actually see their spouse as a partner and their children as a part of them rather than just something they owned. And so the freedom that people saw in Christ was so powerful. And so I grew up that way, and then came back to the States, and my parents planted a church in Eugene, Oregon. And that was wonderful. People were thriving in their gifts. It was a powerful time to see all of that. And I began to see, though, when I left and moved into other ministry situations, that was not always so true here in the US. And I found, for instance, I would have a glass ceiling. There were certain things I could do and other things that I couldn't do. And so that in the midst of that, I had to really learn that God will use a donkey, right? Like he'll speak through anything and use anything. And so how was I supposed to live in humility and working with people no matter what? And it didn't matter if I could speak just into one person's life and then they would speak to thousands. My purpose could still be fulfilled. So it didn't matter where I was, I could fulfill my purpose. I think of Billy Graham as an example. He said, no matter how many people come to the Lord under my watch, there's a woman who has at least one more, and that's the one who brought me to the Lord. And so there's this idea sometimes that we get caught thinking that we have to fulfill something, or worse, we're not doing everything we want to do. And that's somewhat of, it's a little bit American actually, because we have that idea that we have to do so much, but we never know really what God's going to do in the midst of what we give him. The little lunch can turn into, enough to feed 5,000 men and women and children that we don't know about. So it's whatever we have in front of us, if we're faithful with that, he will open the doors for other things.
A lot of your culture and your context will determine what you can do, because if your expectations aren't fulfilled, you'll be frustrated. So, but sometimes you can, those things can change through communication. So when we went to Eureka, California to pastor a church as lead pastors for the first time, Heidi's like, what am I going to do here? And I said, well, because we're in charge as the lead pastors, we can determine that. Like our expectations can adjust. Like, what are you called to do? What are you passionate about? Because in other situations, we had to submit that to someone else and really work within that context. So her expectations were very limited coming into the situation, but then we were able to change that because of because we were empowered to do so.
Sure.
But at the same time, with expectations, we have to communicate a lot about that on a daily basis. So if you're a couple working together, there are many times, I'd say, especially going into a staff meeting, where I had an agenda and I didn't have a lot of time to prepare the agenda because we would have staff meetings like every week. And so I would just take over and like lead the staff meeting, and Heidi'd be like, no, wait a second. I also have an agenda and an expectation, and I've prepared this. And so that's often where we would like to trip over each other and be like, oh man, we got to start talking this through before the meeting. We can't be doing this last minute and each like doing this tug of war. We have two agendas. It's going to take twice as long. So I think when you're ministering together, there is a lot of management of expectations, like for the individual, my expectations, her expectations. We have to communicate a heck of a lot more about those things. And it could be in any situation, staff meetings. If you're going to do a team teaching, if you're going to plan a calendar, like better communicate a lot and communicate well, but you are going to have that tension. I don't think you're going to avoid it. There'll be times when you're going to, stumble over each other. I think it's a little more difficult than just being an individual, like if you're making
for sure
decisions yourself, it's a little easier. So it's a harder path, but a better path.
I'm now thinking kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum. I think, because this is I think sometimes a challenge. And I'm just thinking about myself and my family. My wife had, when I was in staff ministry, she had no desire at all or sense of calling to be up in front of people or even taking charge of a ministry area. She was always faithful to serve somewhere, but she didn't feel like she wanted to or felt called to kind of take charge of a ministry. And so I guess I'm curious, what would your encouragement be to the ministry spouse who who doesn't feel like, man, I'm called into the to be the face of a ministry. I mean, we're all called to serve in ministry, but we're not all called to be the face of a ministry. And so, to the spouse who wants to play the support role and doesn't want to be playing the face role, but you're in a situation where even in complementarian situations, there could be an expectation like, oh, well, a pastor's wife needs to be leading a small group or a women's group or women's ministry or this event, but that, again, that's an external expectation, not necessarily a calling. So what would your encouragement be to that spouse who doesn't want to take such a forward role?
I feel like it's important to honor each other no matter what. And so, but also to encourage each other. The Bible tells us to spur each other on to good works. Mm-hmm. And as even pastors and leaders, we're called to actually empower others. We're really called to equip the church to do the work of the ministry, not to do the work of the ministry as a leader or as a pastor. Yeah. It's actually equipping others to do it. And so often we think differently, think, oh, that's the pastor, that's the one who does everything, and we're just here to just serve, well, the pastor or at their will. But that's not really what scripture tells us. It actually says as leaders, we're supposed to be the servants of all. We come along underneath. Mm-hmm. And so just as an example, if you look at many women are mothers. That's what they're doing already. They're coming underneath and serving their children. They're providing opportunity for their children to be spurred on to good works, to be the best that they can be. And so they're already fulfilling that calling of ministry, really, because and as a leader. So everyone has influence somewhere, whether we think we want to be in front or not, whether we want to be the face or to be behind because we don't want to be in front of people. We still have that calling to continue to serve and be ministers wherever we are.
And I think it has to do with your definition of ministry too. Like for me, ministry isn't a platform. It is as much serving behind the scenes as it is, or in the home as it is in the church. And so to have mutual support of ministry in the broad sense of the word, I think is really important. So there have been many seasons of life where I've pursued ministry that wasn't based around a church platform. So the same thing for her. So when, I was coaching high school, like I've been coaching the last 7 years, track and cross country. That has nothing to do with a platform, but it is ministry. And so for Heidi to support me fully in that was necessary because it took a lot of time and a lot of sacrifice. And so when she was serving, teaching in a community college, like that took a lot of time. Or when she was on city council, again, for me, it was doing that. Those are not church ministries, not a church platform. So, there's the child rearing season where, most moms really want to pour a lot of their time and energy into that. But there may be other dreams and other aspects of calling and other types of ministry that aren't based in the church that I think when, as a couple, you've got to just say, I'm behind you 100%. It could be in the workplace, maybe they have a career, maybe they're going to pursue another degree, maybe they're involved in community theater, like whatever it is. Like to me, ministry is serving other people, and you want to help each other fulfill that dream and that calling. So I think it's important to support those things, because if I was just doing platform ministry at the church and she's trying to do something else, if I can't see what she's doing as ministry, then I'm really not going to be a very big supporter. I might see what she's doing as in conflict with what I'm doing. But, I think it's been really exciting to see each other flourish outside the walls of the church as much as inside the church.
That's such a great point. My wife is a school teacher, and, the ministry that she has to middle school students is immense. And, she'll often say, I'll make some flippant comment foolishly, and she'll say, why don't you come by the middle school? Why don't you sign up as a substitute and come hang out there for a couple of days? And I'm like, no, I'm good.
Right.
And so she's she might be an employee of the public schools, but she's very much in ministry. So
And she might have a pastoral gift too.
Yeah.
Like, you see people pastoring kids and parents, and like, it's just, where is that being expressed? So
yeah, that's really good. I think to kind of broaden that understanding of what that means to be in ministry beyond just standing on a stage on a Sunday.
And I think we're going to see more of that in the US. I think it's going to become, we're going to see, just like in overseas where I was, no one was standing on a stage in front, except for, the communist leaders. So, being aware that this is something that we need to have an understanding and a mindset of, because otherwise we see ministry in a way that we will think we're being blocked from having it happen if we see restrictions. And
that's so good. That's really good, especially coming out of COVID, and especially out west where you guys were. I mean, you really need to just start thinking differently about what does it mean to gather, and what does it mean to be in ministry, and what does it mean to share Christ, and it in contexts other than just the Sunday gathering. That's really good. I want to ask this on a practical level. You guys have served together a lot, sometimes on the same team, on a staff, but other contexts as well. How do you shut down the work conversations? And I know that like work conversations can actually be fun if you both love the work, but it's not always healthy, even if you enjoy it, to be talking about it all the time. So how do you shut that down and just focus on family or laughing together or whatever? How do you guys manage that tension?
I think it's the greatest challenge early in a marriage. Like, you have to establish patterns early on. So when we first were married or had little kids, I mean, like, we had to have a date night, and we had to have like strict boundaries for those conversations, where we would unplug, and we would go out, we would watch TV show or a movie, like, and so I feel like I feel like we've developed more of a habit of that. I mean, Heidi kind of works. He stays on like work more than I do. I have an easier time unplugging than she does. And so there are times where, you just have to be assertive and just say, you know what, I don't really want to talk about that anymore. Like, I'm exhausted, or, feeling like burned out on the subject, and let's just talk about something else. So I would say, planning for it is really important, and having good boundaries and good communication about how you're feeling too.
Yeah, and expressing yourself. One of the things that we had a very strict rule on was no ministry discussion at the table. So we would never sit at, the kitchen table and talk about ministry, no matter what. It wasn't allowed, even though sometimes, like, we always had people pretty much throughout our ministry living with us, interns or other ministry couples or people just pouring into their lives, living life together, for all kinds of various reasons. But we had people in our home, and so we were very intentional, because they would sometimes try to bring that up. So we would be like, oh, that's after dinner conversation, right? Like, that's not something we talk about at the table. And also it helps to be playful, have that mentality. You think about in scripture, all through the Old Testament, Jesus had, or God, put in celebration all the time, celebrating. I mean, gosh, if you follow the Jewish celebrations, that's pretty much all you're doing most of the year, celebrating. Party. Yeah. There's a few times you're not, but and then
and that rhythm of rest. I mean, from the very beginning.
Yeah. And even, you see Jesus go away often in some of the most intense situations. He left, his cousin gets beheaded and he goes off by himself. But then what happened? He's spending time with a father, but then like he ends up just ministering like right after that. But it was because he had that rest, and it was some pretty intense things. And the feeding of 5,000 came right after that. The next day he was, there's just so many things like that in scripture. But Matt is really good at playing, which is awesome. And when we had little kids, I was really good at playing with them, so it made it easier. And he's just really good at playing as well, and thinking about, oh, let's go outside, let's go do this, and so that helps balance that out.
I think
for those of us who are on YouTube, I can see that you guys are fun because you're actually in a like in your travel
Yeah.
travel trailer, like hitting the road. Like
Yeah.
not every couple is doing that. So
Right.
yeah, it's obvious to me that you guys know how to have some fun.
I think the Sabbath is the key thing. Scott, you mentioned that because for us, Sabbath isn't Sunday. It's not working in the ministry. It's like intentionally having a time of rest. And if that's your work, if ministry is your work, then Sabbath for us is like we're not working. So that means we're not talking about that. The other thing that we do is sometimes we will have to schedule. We have to schedule our ministry conversations. So although there's a lot of spontaneous conversations and discussions, there are times when it's like, oh my gosh, our calendar, we just need to go through our calendar, or we need to schedule the time to do our preparation. So we put those times on our calendar. Otherwise, it does just kind of creep into all of our time. Either that or it gets put off and you can't focus on it. So if you're ministering together, you just got to schedule for like the important planning and preparation
as much as play. So
Yeah,
right.
scheduling all of it, like when we had little kids, we had a weekly date night, no matter what. And actually, interestingly enough, our kids loved it. They'd be like, it's date night, because they got to hang out with their favorite babysitter, and so there's things
Right.
that you can do to create an environment of joy and fun for the whole family, even if you're separated, as a couple is really important that the children see. Like that's the most important thing that we're doing as a parent, is being the best spouse we can be, because that's what we're projecting, for their future, is helping become something for their future, Are we doing that well? Is really important.
Yeah, and that's part of another thing ministering together for us is modeling marriage in front of a culture that is pretty dysfunctional. So we want to do that well.
Don't say. You think it's dysfunctional?
Yeah, it adds pressure, on us for sure. Like if you're going to go down that road, like you got to work harder. You are accountable for that. You can't be faking it. But that's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity, because I do think our world is hungry for that, like for good models and, again, not fake, but what is life together really? What can it look like? And so, like she was mentioning, what made me think of that was we did that for our kids. We want to do that for our children. Like as much as we're a good husband and wife, to that degree, we'll be good parents. So the same thing, I think, in the church environment, is that people do appreciate being able to see you living your life together. And again, not every couple does ministry in that way, but I think for us, it's and for those who are able to do that, there's something attractive about that.
People are desperate for good models, and none of us is a great model, but we can strive to be good models. Like we can't do it perfectly, but that's probably one of the most powerful and impacting things. Whenever we've left a situation or been in a congregation, people will say all the time, that's probably the top thing they talk about, is the way we relate to one another and how we love one another and how much that's impacted, or how we've modeled parenting in front of them, or modeled just our relationship. And that's so important, because people are just desperate to see that. We don't have good models around us anymore. We don't live in families. We don't get that generational, in the same way that used to be. And so there's a desperation for anything to be modeled in a way that's not just reading a book or watching a podcast, or, all those things, or TV, television. That's not good models, generally speaking. So where are we doing that? The church should be a great place for that if we can provide it.
That's so true. Well, I have one last question, and this may be kind of weird, but each of you are going to answer, and I want you to see if you can do it in like 30 seconds or less. Okay. So I'm going to put the pressure on you. I know that one of the points that you guys made as we were talking about this beforehand is that you really believe that because you have served together, it has made you better than if you were just serving on your own. And so I guess I'll start with you, Matt. what is one way that you feel like Heidi has made, because you serve together, you're better than you would have been if you were on your own? And then Heidi, same for you. So Matt, we'll start with you.
Well, for me, it just kind of doubles my sphere of influence immediately, because we are one and we are together. So Heidi will connect with a lot of people I will not connect with. She speaks into people's lives that I will never speak into. More people will identify with her than will this, in addition to identifying with me, so that all that creates this multiplication of influence. And so that's definitely, for me, for some, they might see that as a threat. For me, that is just a huge blessing, because it extends my reach just exponentially.
Yeah. Oh, that's really good. That was a good answer, Heidi. Okay. All right. What you got?
Ooh. Matt is probably one of the most disciplined people I've ever met in my life. And because of that, I've learned a lot. I grew up again on the mission field where things were not, things were a much different culture. And so one of the things that he has brought to my life is a disciplined habits, disciplined ways of thinking, rather than just immersion in everything. So that's really helped me a lot in our marriage and in our ministry, and balancing that out with ministry life is so important. And often that's actually the opposite. Many times women tend to have some of that in their life. I meet a lot of women who are just very organized and very, very, but God puts you together with different gifts for his purposes. And so I think the different gifts complement, and then those that are the same, hopefully it can bring you together, not separate you, just becoming more honing us into his image in a better way.
Oh, that's so good. And I think that's such a good point too. I'm this, so in my life and marriage, I'm kind of more of like just pure energy chaos, and my wife is very organized. And I'm so thankful for her, because it gives, it takes all of the energy that I have and helps to direct it. And I feel like I've certainly been able to have more of an impact because there's some structure. Otherwise, it would just be burning all around me in 1,000 directions, but not a lot of heat, but not a lot of energy. And so I'm thankful for both Allison, and also AJ is very disciplined. And so having him, as a team member alongside of me, he really helps go, all right, Scott, let's steer that energy in a particular direction. And I think we all need those people. So I can relate to that, Heidi, as needing that in my life. And man, between the two of you, you're an amazing pair and a great model. And I hope that our listeners today are hearing this through their own lens of their own marriage and going, wow, am I really leveraging this ministry partnership? Again, no matter what your theological context is, it really is irrelevant. Your partners, the Bible says that you're one flesh. And so are you really leveraging, as you were saying, Matt, that multiplied sphere of influence that you can have in ministry, no matter your context? Guys, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. This has been so rewarding. I really appreciate you being on.
Thanks, Scott. It's been great being a part of this conversation. And if anyone does have any questions, they can reach out to us, email us. You'll have a link in the podcast we can put in there, and we'd love to talk more about it. So.
Yes, and that's a great point. I'm double checking here, but you can read Matt's show notes. Matt's wrote the article for this week, or Matt and Heidi. I don't know. Maybe it'll be both of them. Maybe who knows?
We have to talk about that.
You'll have to communicate and collaborate on that. But the show notes for this episode will be at malphursgroup.com/144, because this is episode 144 of the Church Revitalization Podcast. Again, Matt, Heidi, thank you so much for being on the podcast with us today. I've really learned a lot from you guys, and I can't wait for everyone to listen to this. Check it out on YouTube if you'd like to see their amazing setup they've got, and the beautiful flowers, by the way. I don't know, did you get those just for this podcast, or do you always have fresh flowers there?
They're actually not fresh. They're made of wood.
Oh, you could have lied and said that they were red.
The fact that made of wood is even more amazing.
I know.
Yeah, they look great. They look really good. So yeah, malphursgroup.com/144. That's where you can read the article. You can watch us on YouTube and like, subscribe, do all those things. We appreciate you guys. Thanks, Heidi and Matt. Y'all have a great rest of your day. And we'll be back next week with more on the Church Revitalization Podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, God.